Let me tell me about a year ago. Salty put on a little show. If you like math, it was really great because it runs the numbers on all star dates. But with the current new show, the numbers just don't seem to flow. Why bother doing this? Many ask. Why would Salty take this job to task? After all, Section 31 does suck. But it is true that Salty does not give a fuck.
Hey guys, Michael J. Crawford here, and kind of struggling with this a little bit because on the one hand, there's the serious issue of how the stardate system works, and particularly with Section 31, how it could actually fit into current canonical Trek. On the other hand, as some people point out, Section 31 sucks so darn bad, who cares? Which I can understand that, but unfortunately, I'm also one of those, as one person said in the comments of a recent video, I'm one of those pedantic idiots that just can't leave it alone, I guess. So, here's the thing. I know that it has been said repeatedly by some of the producers of Section 31 that the show takes place in the so-called Lost Era, the time in between Star Trek VI and Star Trek The Next Generation. However, the stardate clearly doesn't work as far as when it could possibly take place. So, I dug up some research that I did in the past on my other channel about stardates, and I'm going to present all of that to you here and then follow it up with a brief update to it to include some of the weirdness with stardates that have come in so-called new Trek. That is Discovery, Strange New Worlds, and of course, Section 31. So, without further ado, here's me from the past. Hey guys, Michael J. Crawford here, and welcome to What the is a stardate? So, before you get really mad and start putting comments in about what an idiot I am, let me say this. I'm not referring to the well-documented and well-organized stardate system that we see in the later iterations of Star Trek, starting with Star Trek The Next Generation, and continuing on through Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and all the way through to the current era of Trek. I'm talking about in the original series when stardates seemed to make no sense whatsoever. I want to see if we can make heads or tails of the stardate system and figure out exactly what a stardate even is in the original series. So let's start with the first actual on-screen depiction of a stardate in real time.
Check elapsed time, Mr. Sulu.
My chronometer's running backwards, sir.
So based on what we see on this clip, we can actually glean quite a bit. It would seem that a stardate is a 24-hour day. Each stardate is divided into a tenth of a day, and that's where you get the decimal. So when we saw stardate 1704.9, it was shortly before midnight. However, at 1705.0, it was shortly after midnight. However, in the later clip, in the end of the time warp, we see the stardate of 1702.0, where it is shortly after midnight again.
Jimmy, sir. Power. Reversing.
Seventeen 1702.0 is about 3 stardates before 1705.0, and at the end we hear Spock say this.
What did it do to us?
We've regressed in time 71 hours. It is now 3 days ago, Captain.
So, mystery solved. No problem whatsoever. We know exactly how stardates work. Let's calculate a little bit of fun about James T. Kirk's career. The only time in Star Trek canon that Kirk actually stated his age was in the episode The Deadly Years.
Oh, I'm 34. I'm 34 years old.
Captain's log, stardate 3478.2.
Okay, with these two pieces of information, let's take a look at Kirk through the years.
Captain's log, stardate 1312.4. Is this some warning they've left behind?
Your move, Captain.
We should have intercepted by now. The bridge said they'd call.
Captain's log, stardate 5943.7.
Captain's log, stardate 7412.6, 1.8 hours from launch. In order to intercept the intruder at the earliest possible time, we must...
Captain's log, stardate 8141.6. Starship Enterprise departing for SETI Alpha 5 to pick up the crew of USS Reliant. All is well.
Captain's log, stardate 9529.1. This is the final cruise of the Starship Enterprise under my command. This ship and her history will shortly become the care.
So before we go on, I want to address a couple of things. First, why I think this is the best explanation of stardates that you could possibly come up with, which is that it is the only explanation of stardates that doesn't violate existing canon. That is, that existing canon does in fact show that one stardate equals one 24-hour day, at least during the TOS era. And while I do know that some people don't like the fact that I'm using the remastered version of Star Trek because the original version of The Naked Time doesn't actually show stardates on Sulu's console, the remastered version of Star Trek is in fact canonical. And while some people may not like that, well, I'm sorry, you can have your opinion, but you can't have your own facts. The other part is that, well, it does line up fairly well as far as Kirk's general age range during the original series and during the movie era. However, it does also have a couple of problems. Most notably, that the 5-year mission during the original series takes about 12 years to complete. Also, we have this scene.
There's a man out there I haven't seen in 15 years. He's trying to kill me. You show me his son, I'd be happy to help him.
So the Khan incident happened around stardate 8141, while the episode Space Seed took place in the stardate 3141, exactly 5,000 stardates earlier, which interestingly enough was 13.69 years, or, Kirk was approximating nearly 15 years earlier. It's almost as if Harv Bennett and Nicholas Meyer did their homework and purposely put it around 15 years later when they figured the star date for Khan. So maybe, just maybe, this is the right way. Despite the fact that the 5-year mission took about 12 years to complete, despite the fact that Kirk retired at the age of 50, well, I think that the 1 day to 1 star date is in fact the best way to calculate star dates in the TOS era. That being said, I do want to give credit where credit is due. Richie Poole, good friend and longtime supporter of the channel, has been going back and forth with me in comments about his thoughts on this, and he believes that we should continue to use the next generation system of 1,000 star dates per calendar year, which means one star date would only be a fraction of a day. The advantage to this would primarily be that the 5-year mission would still only be 5 years, because the totality of the star dates from the beginning to the end of the original series is only a little over 5,000 star dates. Let me explain where the problems would come in there. We can start off with the calculations we just did, since we know that the time from Space Seed to the Wrath of Khan is exactly 5,000 star dates. If 1,000 star dates is 1 year, that means there's only 5 years between the two, which means that Kirk has no idea what he's talking about when he says it's been 15 years since he's seen Khan. Just for fun, let's take a look at that timeline we played earlier, except adjusting for the 1,000 stardates per year timeline.
Oh, I'm 34. I'm 34 years old.
Captain's log, stardate 1312.4. Is this some warning they've left behind?
Your move, Captain.
We should have intercepted by now. The bridge said they'd call.
Captain's log, stardate 5943.7.
Captain's log, stardate 7412.6, 1.8 hours from launch. In order to intercept the intruder at the earliest possible time, we must...
Captain's log, stardate 8141.6. Starship Enterprise departing for SETI Alpha 5 to pick up the crew of USS Reliant. All is well.
Captain's log, stardate 9529.1. This is the final cruise of the Starship Enterprise under my command. This ship and her history will shortly become the
So yeah, I have to say that if you look at it objectively, I think that if you put 1,000 stardates per year, you do fix the 5-year issue for the mission, the 5-year mission of the original series, but you make Kirk implausibly young for the movie era. I do think it makes more sense to do 1 stardate per day for the original series era, and just assume that in some way they changed the calendar sometime between then and the TNG era. Hey guys, welcome to What the F*** is a Stardate Part 2, The Next Generation. So, I have to say, after making the last video, I wasn't planning on doing a part 2, but then I started looking at some things and I owe you guys an apology. I said something that was blatantly false in my last video, and well, frankly, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that. The last thing I want to do on this channel is say things that are just untrue. So first, let me replay the clip of the untrue comment. Let me say this. I'm not referring to the well-documented and well-organized stardate system that we see in the later iterations of Star Trek, starting with Star Trek The Next Generation and continuing on through Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and all the way through to the current era of Trek. Why do I say that statement's untrue? Well, simple. Upon closer examination, it turns out that that statement is a pile of shit. Oh, not the well-documented and well-organized part. That makes perfect sense. However, in comparison, the original series stardates make a whole lot more sense than the Next Generation era stardates, which we'll get into right now. So with the original stardates, we were able to figure out fairly easily that 1 stardate equals 1 day, 1 24-hour period. And therefore, 1 year was 365 stardates. And so to calculate how many years old, for example, James T. Kirk was,
I'm 34. I'm 34 years old.
all we had to do was find out his established age at one point, and then figure out how many stardates there were, divide by 365, etc., do the math. Well, with the Next Generation, it seems a little different, because each season of Star Trek The Next Generation is approximately 1,000 stardates.
Captain's log, stardate 41153.7. Our destination is planet Deneb 4.
Captain's log, stardate 42073.1. There has been an outbreak of an unclassified plasma plague in the Rocelli system. Captain's log, stardate 43125.8. We have entered a spectacular binary star system in the Cavis Alpha sector.
First Officer's log, stardate 44001.4. The Borg ship has resumed its course toward Earth. We are unable to pursue, pending repairs to the Enterprise.
Captain's log, stardate 45047.2. The Enterprise is en route to the uninhabited Eladrel system. Its location is near the territory occupied by an enigmatic race known as the Children of Tama. Captain's log, stardate 46001.3. Everyone who should be in the 19th century is safely there,
and those who should be in the 24th are here. Captain's log, stardate 47025.4. We have returned to Federation space and are en route to Starbase 295. What's today's date? The date.
Stardate 47988.
47988.
Captain, what's wrong?
47988.
All Good Things wraps up on Stardate 47988.0. 6,834.3 stardates after Encounter Farpoint, which, if one stardate equal 1 day, would be 18.72 years. In Star Trek The Next Generation, they never say 5-year mission. They say continuing mission for the Enterprise. So, them being out there for 18.72 years would be no big deal, except that it seems that one season does in fact equal 1 year in universe, because we have dialogue in the final episode to indicate that.
Kill all the lawyers, which was done, leading to the rule, guilty until proven innocent.
Of course, bringing the innocent to trial would be unfair.
The last time that I stood here was 7 years ago.
7 years ago? How little do you mortals understand time. Must you be so linear, Jean-Luc?
So, it seems patently obvious that, at least in the Next Generation era, 1 year equals 1,000 stardates, which means that about 2.74 stardates equals 1 24-hour day. And we can further extrapolate that, while yes, we're approximating a little bit as to not get too crazy with the decimal points here, that one stardate is now approximately 8.75 hours. Okay, I'm okay with that. It's a little weird, but fine. And look, I know I'm a little older than most of my subscribers on YouTube, so yeah, I'm more of an original series guy. And I know that most of my friends that are Next Generation era fans tell me about how things in the Next Generation era are more carefully thought out than the original series. And stardates were just kind of slapped together in the original series. But in Next Generation, it was a more carefully thought out process. And that's why you can see exactly what season and episode order just based on the stardate, and it just makes a whole lot more sense. Okay, so the next question should be obvious. At what point did the stardate change from a 24-hour day to approximately 8 hours and 45 minutes? And is there any way to glean this from existing canon? Now, before I attempt to answer this, and I am going to attempt to answer it, I do want to say this. For people that want to say that this is all part of Gene Roddenberry's grand vision, or something that Gene Roddenberry may have intended, or whatever, for just a moment, forget about Gene Roddenberry's intentions, because Gene Roddenberry had a very, very nasty habit, and that habit was he liked to canonize and decanonize things on a whim. Why did he do this? Because sometimes he just wanted to do something that was blatantly contradictory to something he had done before. This was no secret among the people who had produced and worked on Star Trek. You can look at the writings of Paula Block, of Richard Arnold, and many others who had worked behind the scenes on Star Trek to know that Gene Roddenberry did not have some gold standard to canon, and in fact, it was just a point-by-point, well, if I want to write something now that contradicts something that happened before, then the something that happened before is no longer canon as far as he's concerned. The problem is that Gene Roddenberry never saw Star Trek itself as an institution like we, the fans, do. Consider for just a moment this quote from Richard Arnold from 1991, who worked directly for and with Gene Roddenberry, and was asked specifically what is and is not canon. Quote, "But generally, canon is the original series, not really the animated, the first movie to a certain extent, the rest of the films in certain aspects, but not in all. I know that is very difficult to understand. It is literally point by point. I sometimes do not know how he's going to answer," he being Gene Roddenberry, "when I go into his office. I really do not always know. And I know it better than probably anybody what it is that Gene likes and doesn't. As to why did the stardates change? Well, because they felt like changing it. Why is it that Warp 10 is now the speed limit of the universe, when in the original series they went way faster than Warp 10? Because they felt like there needed to be a speed limit. It doesn't matter that it contradicted the past. They simply retconned the past to no longer exist. It's a form of doublespeak. It's just, since it's in a fictional universe, we tend to accept it a little more readily. And we as fans then try to come up with what we refer to as headcanon to try to explain how it happened within the universe in order to make the universe continue to work. The good news is, at least with stardates, I think that there is a good viable reason for the switch. And that reason is there wasn't a switch. I came to this conclusion when looking for the actual date that they might have switched it. The first place I looked was to try and find something that bridges the gap between the original series and Star Trek The Next Generation. The only thing I knew of directly was the appearance of Admiral Leonard McCoy in the first episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, in which we do have a stardate and McCoy's aide.
Captain's log, stardate 41153.7.
What's so damn troublesome about not having died? How old do you think I am anyway?
137 years, Admiral, according to Starfleet records.
I figured based on this, let's go back to the last TOS stardate and see how far off is it to try and figure out about when the calendar must have changed.
Captain's log, stardate 9529.1. This is the final cruise of the Starship Enterprise under my command.
McCoy's age is never explicitly stated in the original series or in the first six Star Trek films. However, we can simply use basic math to figure out how old McCoy should be at this point. All we have to do is look at the 137 years old that McCoy was on stardate 41153.7, and then figure out the difference in number of stardates to stardate 9529.1, divide that by 365, and we should have the number of years, and we come up with 51 years old at the time of the undiscovered country. Now, I'm sure many of you are thinking that, well, McCoy seems obviously a bit older than 51. But the interesting thing is that using the original series stardates, we already figured out that Kirk was only 50 at the time of the undiscovered country, which means that McCoy is actually older than Kirk, which would be about right. It's just that they both seem a little younger than maybe they should be. Now, you could probably come up with a reasonable explanation, like, for example, among the many diseases and various radiations and stuff they were exposed to, perhaps they show signs of aging a little faster than what the norm would be. But what really grabbed me here was the simple fact that the stardates themselves seem very consistent from the original series to the Next Generation era, with the exception of the length of a year. Why did that seem to change? And I'm pretty sure that the year must have changed at this point, because while you might think that it's a little bit of a stretch to say that Dr. McCoy is 51, I'd say it's quite a stretch to suggest that he's 106 at the time of the undiscovered country, which is what his age would be if it was 1,000 stardates per year. All that being said, we can patently reject the 1,000-day year out of hand simply because we know that it was more than 31 years in between the time of Dr. McCoy and the Next Generation era. How do we know this for certain? Because of this.
Hi.
So we know with 100% certainty that 78 years had passed from the launch of the Enterprise B to the time of Star Trek Generations, the destruction of the Enterprise D.
Captain's log, stardate 48632.4. Dr. Crusher has informed me that Data's emotion chip has been fused into his neural net and cannot be removed.
Okay, so this is where things start to get really interesting. Based on Picard's log entry from the movie Generations and Kirk's log entry from the end of The Undiscovered Country, we can determine that the movie Generations takes place 107 years after Undiscovered Country. That's assuming the TOS era stardates. But then that would mean, in order to make it so that Generations takes place 78 years after the launch of the Enterprise B, Kirk and his crew would have had to have been retired for 29 years prior to the launch of the Enterprise B. So is there anything in canon we can use to corroborate almost 3 decades of no Enterprise?
This is the first Starship Enterprise in 30 years without James T. Kirk in command. How do you feel about that, sir?
Oh, just fine. I'm glad to be here to send her on her way.
And what if...
Now, the first time I heard this reporter annoying Captain Kirk with this line, I just assumed she meant that, well, Kirk had served as captain of the Enterprise for 30 years, and now there's an Enterprise without Kirk in command. But then, after thinking about it, well, Kirk wasn't in command of the Enterprise for 30 years. After all, after the 5-year mission, he took a position as Chief of Starfleet Operations. Decker was actually in command of the Enterprise up until the V'ger incident, at least during the refit time. And then Spock was in command of the Enterprise for at least some time up until the point of Star Trek II, when Kirk assumed command in order to deal with Khan. It wasn't until the commission of the Enterprise A that Kirk was a full-time starship captain once again. And while we don't know exactly how long Kirk served in Starfleet after the Undiscovered Country, if at all, we do know that the Enterprise was about to be decommissioned.
We're to put back to space dock immediately, to be decommissioned.
If I were human, I believe my response would be go to hell.
Which means that his tenure as captain of the Enterprise was over. Which means what she must have meant is that there was a 30-year gap in which there was no Starship Enterprise with Kirk in command.
This is the first Starship Enterprise in 30 years without James T. Kirk in command. How do you feel about that, sir?
So thanks to the power of math.
This is the power of math, people! Come on!
You are correct, Ensign.
What we have learned so far is that the timelines of the original series and Star Trek The Next Generation do indeed line up fine if we're using the original series stardates. Not only that, but the apparent problem of Kirk only being 50 years old at the time of the Undiscovered Country and hence his retirement from Starfleet isn't really so much a problem if we consider that when we see him 30 years later, he's 80 years old in the Undiscovered Country. You might think, well, wait a minute, isn't 50 awfully young to be retiring? Not from the military. On average, enlisted personnel in the military retire at the age of 41, and officers at high rank, which is where Kirk would be, are required to retire after 30 years. So if Kirk received his commission somewhere around the age of 20, he would actually be required to retire at age 50. But what about the Next Generation? Is there any way to corroborate any of this using only Star Trek The Next Generation? Well, strangely enough, yes, there is. Now, unfortunately, in Star Trek The Next Generation, I couldn't find something quite as easy and obvious to use like Sulu's time clock. However, I did find a couple of episodes where we can use various captain's logs and timestamps to try and figure out how much time has actually elapsed and do a little bit of math to figure out, well, are the stardates being accurate or not?
This is the power of math, people!
Let's look at the also appropriately named episode, Time Squared.
Captain's log, stardate 42679.2. While en route to the Endicott system, we have encountered a Federation shuttlecraft which seems to have appeared out of nowhere.
Hey, Data. Look at the stardate. 42679.5.
So in the episode Time Squared, they find a shuttlecraft apparently from the future. And when Geordi looks at the chronometer on the shuttlecraft, they find that it has a stardate that is 3/10 ahead of the time that was in the opening captain's log from this episode. So, how much time is 3/10 of one stardate? Well, guess what we get to use? That's right.
This is the power of math, people!
Man, I wish they hadn't done that. Anyway, if we are to use the TNG concept of 1,000 stardates divided by a 365-day year, where one stardate equals 8.75 hours, 3 ticks on the good old stardate clock, 3/10 of a stardate, as we're seeing here, would be 2.625 hours, or roughly 2 hours and 40 minutes, which means that assuming that they grabbed the shuttle and hooked up the shuttle to power immediately upon Picard giving his log at the beginning of the episode, the shuttle's chronometer can be no more than 2 hours and 40 minutes ahead of the chronometer on the Enterprise. However, keep in mind that they do have to do a couple of things to hook the shuttle up, so some time has to pass. That's just a fact. That being said, if we're talking about the TOS era, then 3 ticks on the stardate clock would actually be closer to 7.2 hours, or about 7 hours and 12 minutes or so. And so that means that if the time frame is somewhere in between that 2 hours and 40 minutes and 7 hours and 12 minutes, then we pretty much confirm the TOS time. If it's more than 7 hours, well, then it's something else. And if it's less than 2 hours and 40 minutes, then we've confirmed the TNG time. So let's take a look at what Geordi says next.
Captain.
Go ahead.
Captain, we've been able to reactivate the shuttle, and the onboard clock indicates that the shuttle is 6 hours in front of us.
So there you have it. Picard enters his initial log at stardate 42679.2. They detect a shuttle. They bring the shuttle into the ship. They find out the mysterious occupant of the shuttle. Data and Geordi spend a little bit of time hooking up the power to the shuttle, adapting the power for the shuttle. And then, after about an hour and 12 minutes of work, Geordi discovers that the shuttle's clock is 6 hours ahead. Sounds pretty cut and dry to me. However, while that does solve the 1 starday equals 1 day issue, that doesn't quite resolve why is it then that 1 year seems to equal 1,000 days. And then it dawned on me, we're all assuming that they're using an Earth calendar, even though on Earth there are in fact multiple calendars in active use. While the Western world pretty much takes for granted that the current year as of this writing is 2023, that is a specifically Western and specifically Christian concept. After all, the 2023 in our calendar represents the year of our Lord, 2023. While there is an updated version to say that rather than the year of our Lord, that the 2023 should be in the common era, the common era would still be in the year of our Lord. So it's still based on the birth of Christ. However, if I was going by the Islamic calendar, the current year will be 1444. According to the Chinese calendar, the year is 4719. In the Hebrew calendar, the current year is 5784. So the fact that we have multiple calendars in use just on Earth, why the heck would we think there's only one calendar in use in space? Well, obviously, an organization as vast as the Federation would need to standardize its dating system, or it would be impossible to set a meeting place and time for any two people. So they came up with a system known as stardates. Stardates uses a 1,000-day system for a year and uses a 24-hour day cycle, most likely because most humanoid species, and it does seem that the majority of Federation species are humanoid, require something near a 24-hour day-night cycle. Based on that, when we hear the year being 1,000 days long, it's not an Earth year, it's a star year. And as you might have imagined, I can find a couple of clips in the original series to corroborate this.
On Earth today, it's Thanksgiving. It's the crew has to eat synthetic meatloaf, I wanted to look like turkey.
In the episode Charlie X, while Kirk gets a captain's log saying the stardate is 1533.6, he also tells the chef that on Earth it's Thanksgiving, and so he wants the synthetic meatloaf to look like turkey, because Kirk is just a nice guy. Obviously, there's nothing about stardate 1533.6 to indicate the month of November or the idea that it is a special holiday of any kind, and so it would seem obvious that they are using a different calendar aboard ship than they are back home on Earth, or there wouldn't be a Thanksgiving. So that teaches us two very important things. One, that they are indeed using a very different calendar than the Gregorian calendar that we are used to today. And two, that back home on Earth, they are in fact still using the Gregorian calendar or something like it if they are still measuring days in the traditional manner.
Isn't it unusual for a Vulcan to retire at your age? After all, you're only 102.
102.437 precisely, Doctor. Measured in your years.
Now here we have a couple of things that's interesting too. One, McCoy makes the mistake of actually calling out Sarek's age based on human age, saying that he's 102 years old. Obviously, that 102 years old is based on Earth years. And so Sarek, being a Vulcan and therefore a dick, decides to take it to the next level and give him the more precise measurement and also point out to him that he is converting it to their units of measurement for him. Now, unfortunately, we don't find out exactly how many Vulcan years that would be. It's entirely possible that Sarek would be 45 or 550. We have no idea because we don't know how long a Vulcan year is. But what we do know is that they're not talking about star dates. So here's the best part of all this, is that if we take this calendar system to where the Universal Federation calendar is a 1,000-day calendar with a 24-hour day, however, humans still use something like a Gregorian calendar. Vulcans use whatever calendar they choose to use, and every other species can use whatever they want locally. Then Kirk's 5-year mission did indeed take 5 years. 5 star years, 5 standard Federation years. However, those 5 years equated to 12 years of Earth time because it's a different calendar. Likewise, when Picard was telling Q that it was 7 years ago that he last stood in front of him, he was referring to 7 star years. And what's interesting is that if you pay attention to the scene, Q then immediately gets indignant at Picard, not because he finds Picard annoying, but because he gets tired of the way the humans deal with measuring time.
The last time that I stood here was 7 years ago.
7 years ago? How little do you mortals understand time? Must you be so linear, Jean-Luc?
So there you have it. Stardates completely solved. One synchronous system that has lasted from the original series all the way through Next Generation, 1,000 days per year, one stardate per 24-hour day. The stardate calendar is independent of the Gregorian calendar or any other measurement of time. It all just makes sense now. Yep, not a single stardate out of order. Everything just makes sense and all fits together perfectly.
First officer's log, stardate 1207.3.
Personal log, stardate 1201.7.
Okay, so maybe season 2 of Discovery ended 5 days before season 1 started?
Captain's log, stardate 2344.2.
Captain's log, stardate 2712.4.
Ship's log, stardate 2124.5.
And maybe season 2 of Strange New Worlds took place midway through season 1 of the original series?
What is the current star date?
Stardate 223304.
Okay, so how does all this fit with Discovery and stuff? Obviously, at the end of part 2 of my Stardate videos, I jokingly threw some stuff in there from Discovery and Strange New Worlds, because at that point I figured, okay, those shows just kind of ignore canonical Stardates from before, and so it's impossible to reconcile all this. And that's kind of just the assumption I was going on, and that's kind of the assumption I was going on with Section 31's Stardate as well. And then it kind of hit me that actually there may be a proper in-universe explanation that does indeed repair all of this. So, in order to really get that, we need to once again look at the earliest Stardate from the original series. Okay, so if the first Stardate in the calendar that we know continues all the way through the next generation was at 1312.4 at the beginning of Kirk's 5-year mission, well, then we know that the calendar had only started 1,312.4 days prior, which would mean that Stardate 1 would have occurred approximately 3.59 years ago, or we'll just say 3.5 years, which would also mean that anything that occurred prior to 3.5 years before Captain Kirk's first log entry would in fact have to use a different dating system. We also know that Strange New Worlds takes place some 7 to 8 years prior to the original series, and Star Trek Discovery took place prior to that, which means that the dates that we see in Strange New Worlds and on Star Trek Discovery are not the same calendar system. Now, could there be an explanation as to why Spock gave a date earlier than Michael Burnham's Stardate, even though we know that Spock recorded his entry at least 1.5 to 2 years later? Well, yeah, actually, the simplest explanation would be that prior to there being a universal Stardate system that started at Stardate 1, some 3.5 years before Captain Kirk started his 5-year mission, well, every ship probably kept their own logs and their own dating system based on the time since the ship's launch, which means that the Enterprise, the Shinzo, and any other starship could all have different star dates just based on that ship's particular length of mission. Now, this, of course, would have the effect of making Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Strange New Worlds' odd star dates fit perfectly into the current Trek canon without any problems as far as continuity errors. And since Enterprise simply used Gregorian calendar dates, it wouldn't be a problem anyway.
Captain Starlog, September 12th, 2152.
But that leaves us with, well, Section 31. You know, somehow I just knew Section 31 was going to screw everything up. Based on everything that I've been talking about and based on what we see on screen, it is simply impossible that Section 31 could have taken place during the so-called Lost Era. But wait, Salty, some well-informed fan may interject. What about the fact that we actually see, if you look really, really carefully on Georgiou's wall, some phasers that clearly were from the film era, not TOS? Well, there's a couple of possibilities for that. One would be time-traveling shenanigans, which we already know Georgiou time-traveled at least once when she came back from the future. Another possibility, granted, this one is a little bit of a stretch to some, would be that, well, maybe you didn't really see what you thought you saw. Yeah, those look like that could be a phaser from TOS, and that looks like it could be a phaser from Star Trek VI, but they're also very fuzzy images, so it's entirely possible that it's some other design, and because we can't see the clear details, we just can't quite make it out. The final possibility is that these could be prototype weapons. These could be weapons that will, in fact, become the phasers that we know from these various other times. These are just early models of them. Any of those could easily explain the wall. The problem is that you can't explain away the star date at the beginning of the episode. You see, the problem is that what we see on the wall, okay, million different possible explanations other than this show takes place in the Lost Era. Yes, this show takes place in the Lost Era is the simplest explanation for that, but then it complicates the stardate system dramatically, because unlike when a character is talking or giving exposition in a film, the stardate is given to us directly by the writers. The stardate is put on screen and clearly said, this is the date. This is not a character's opinion of the date. This is not some kind of subjective opinion of the date. This is the writers informing the viewers exactly when this show takes place. And this show takes place on stardate 1292.4, which, if this show takes place in the same calendar as the original series through Next Generation eras, would be about 20 days before the episode where No Man Has Gone Before. The problem is that the only real viable alternative is that this is part of a separate calendar system, such as what we see on Discovery and Strange New Worlds, and that would mean that instead of being 20 days prior to the original series, it would be at least 3.5 years prior to the original series. So I actually think putting it as 20 days prior, unfortunately, is the best possible date. So what about Rachel Garrett? So obviously with Rachel Garrett, we get some problems. She was approximately age 32 on stardate 1292.4. That's based on the age of the actress who played her. However, yesterday's Enterprise took place at stardate 43625.2, which would be just about 116 years later. Data states in dialogue that the Enterprise C was last seen 22 years, 3 months, 4 days prior to that, which means that if we do the math, the 116 years, just to round things off, minus the 22 years earlier that the Enterprise C was lost, means that Garrett was approximately 126 years old, assuming she was the same age as the actress in Section 31. If we want to be generous, she could have been as young as, say, 110. Why isn't she 110 years old when we see her in yesterday's Enterprise? The best I can say is maybe at some point after Section 31, Rachel Garrett is put into some kind of stasis for 50 or 60 years to keep her from aging. Why she was put in stasis, who knows? You could write about 1,000 different reasons, but it's the only viable way to explain her age. And the nice thing is that, of course, they have an augment with them, which means they probably have access to an augment's cryotube. So, yeah, you could definitely write it into the story somehow. Although the bottom line is, this was extraordinarily careless writing, and I think Rachel Garrett was simply thrown into the show to titillate fans into thinking there was going to be some kind of connective tissue between Section 31 and Star Trek The Next Generation, which, of course, well, we all know how that turned out. Yeah. So, I hope you enjoyed this rather lengthy discussion on star dates. I think it was worth it. I hope you did too. Let me know if you're interested in more of these long-form videos. In the meantime, thanks for watching. And, I know I should say this kind of crap. I hate saying it. So like, comment, subscribe, please. Patreon, blah, blah, blah.
Stardate 1 was 3.5 years before Kirk. Salty figured that one out and did the math and even showed his work.